Good evening, everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for coming. It's really an honor to welcome all of you, and I really appreciate your presence with us here tonight. I'm Karen Umamoto. I'm the Helen and Morgan Chu Endowed Director's Chair of Asian American Studies Center and Professor of Asian American Studies and Urban Planning. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Tongva peoples as traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the land upon which we now gather. Tonight is a very special night for us as we have the privilege of hearing from Professor May Ngai of Columbia University, someone who I met a number of decades ago, right? When we were both young. Before we begin, however, I'd like to say a few words of thanks. First to the late Stanley Kwok Lau and Dora Wong Lau, after whom this lecture series is named and whose bequest has made this series possible. Our co-sponsor is the Office of Residential Life, and I want to give a big shout out to Keith Camacho, Professor Keith Camacho. Yeah. And resident assistants Gabby Sarmiento, Manali Gadiali, and Evan Lowell. Yes, thank you. We've also received support from the UCLA Asian American Studies Department, the UCLA Advisory Council on Immigration Policy, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and the Luskin School of Public Affairs. And finally, we have the exceptionally dedicated staff of the Asian American Studies Center. And I'd like to point out Meg Thornton, who was the lead coordinator. Yeah. On the part of the Asian American Studies Center with support from Barbara Ramos, Grace Lee, and many others. This is the first of a two-part series on asylum and deportation. We hope you will attend the second event here on the Hill next week, Thursday, on deportation and what people are doing to intervene in current practices. This event is organized together with leadership from the United Khmer Students, Asian Pacific Coalition, the Vietnamese, yeah, give them a hand, VSU, Vietnamese Student Union, and the Asian American Studies Graduate Student Association. Thank you. This speaker series marks, I think I got out of slideshow mode. This speaker series marks 50 years of Asian American Studies here at UCLA. Along with the other ethnic studies centers, the Chicano Studies Research Center, the American Indian Studies Center, the Bunch Center for African American Studies, all under the umbrella of the Institute of American Cultures. We kick off, as the Asian American Studies Center, series of events in coordination with the other ethnic studies centers. So 50 years ago, in 1969, carried with the momentum of the civil rights, Black power, anti-war, and feminist movements of the 1960s, students here at UCLA demanded more access to higher education that opened the doors for all of us to be here, and to demand an education that was relevant, right, to the lives and experiences that they were facing as part of US society, and that was the birth of ethnic studies. They followed in the footsteps of those who shut down San Francisco State University for a record 11 months, or 5 months, the longest student strike in American history, those at UC Berkeley and many other campuses across the country, so that programs like ethnic studies and the academic advancement program here at UCLA were a result of those efforts. These programs have become premier programs in the nation and have played a critical role in advancing diversity on campus over the years. So it's in the spirit of placing issues that are relevant to our futures at the center of our education that we focus tonight on a topic not only affecting some of our families, but that has shaped the political and racial discourse of our nation, as well as the international community. These are the important topics of immigration and asylum. Many of you, I'm sure, are concerned about the vitriol that has arisen from the top echelons of government that has sparked racial and religious violence and hatred. To help us understand the current controversy, we've invited one of the most well-respected historians of immigration history, Professor Ngai, to provide a longer historical context that we may better understand what is happening today. I hope this evening's exchange, with the help of commentator and moderator Professor Hiroshi Motomura from our UCLA School of Law, will equip us to engage in more reasoned debate and thoughtful problem solving on this very sticky issue. To introduce our speaker and moderator, I would like to call up to the podium Office of Residential Life Resident Assistants, who worked hard in helping to pull together this program, starting with Gabby. Where's Gabby? Can you give our ORL RAs a big hand? Thank you.
Hello, good evening. I am Gabby Sarmiento. I am a resident assistant for Dykstra Hall, and I am also a third-year anthropology major and global health minor. In the future, I hope to work through the intersections of public health and Asian American studies. And before I formally introduce Professor Ngai, just one housekeeping thing we have to take care of. We will be passing out index cards, so feel free to jot down questions that you have throughout the lecture, and they will be answered during the Q&A session after. But yes, so on behalf of UCLA Residential Life, it is with pleasure that we formally introduce Professor Ngai. She is a professor of Asian American Studies and History, and she's also a legal and political historian interested in questions of immigration, citizenship, and nationalism. She is the author of the award-winning Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens, and the Making of Modern America, as well as The Lucky Ones, One Family, and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America. Professor Ngai has written on immigration history and policy for the Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, The Nation, and the Boston Review. Before becoming a historian, she was a labor union organizer and educator in New York City, working for District 65 and the Consortium for Worker Education. She is now writing The Chinese Question, a study of Chinese gold miners and racial politics in 19th century California, Australia, and South Africa, as well as Nation of Immigrants, a short history of an idea. So I would like to formally introduce Professor Ngai.
So much, Gabby, for that nice introduction. I'm just really honored and thrilled to be here at UCLA. So I'm very grateful for the invitation, and it's a great privilege to speak to you tonight. I want to thank the staff of Asian American Studies, especially Meg, the staff here at Northwest Campus, the people in the tech booth. Thank you for making everything run so smoothly. And of course, a big thank you to Professor Keith Camacho, Professor Karen Umamoto, and Professor Hiroshi Motomura. Did you want me to speak louder? Closer to the mic, okay. So let me start. At the base of the Statue of Liberty is a bronze plaque engraved with Emma Lazarus's famous poem, The New Colossus. For many people, this poem expresses the idea of America as a nation of immigrants. Its most famous lines are, of course, those spoken by the statue herself. A mighty woman with a torch cries with silent lips, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Lazarus called the statue, the speaker of those lines, not the Statue of Liberty as we know it, but Mother of Exiles. I draw attention to this because it suggests that we might read this welcome of immigrants in a different way than it is conventionally understood. That is to say, we tend to think of immigrants who came into New York Harbor in the late 19th century, and more generally throughout American history, as the tired and poor of the world, who then, by dint of their hard work, ambition, prove that anyone can come to the United States and succeed. Lazarus's reference to immigrants as exiles who are yearning to be free, however, suggests a view of America that is not just a land of opportunity, but also a land of refuge from persecution and oppression. Lazarus, herself the daughter of a wealthy Jewish family in New York, was moved to write this poem by the anti-Jewish pogroms in Tsarist Russia and her sympathy for the Jewish immigrants who were arriving in New York in large numbers at the time. And I start with this poem because it suggests that in the 19th century, there was not a sharp distinction between those who immigrated for economic improvement and those whom today we would call political migrants or refugees and asylees. Many migrants in the 19th century were motivated by both economic and political factors. The Germans after the failed 1848 revolution, Irish exiled from famine and British colonial oppression, Chinese displaced by the Taiping Rebellion, and Lazarus's Jews fleeing Tsarist pogroms. The distinction between the economic and the political in the world migration arose only in the 20th century, during the Second World War and in its aftermath, when millions of people fled persecution or were uprooted by the ravages of war itself. The figure of the refugee was born of emergency, at a time when restrictive immigration laws made it difficult, if not impossible, to respond to the political and humanitarian crisis created by fascism and war. These emergencies gave rise to a new international regime that created the refugee as a new legal subject. For better and for worse, the distinction between economic and political migrants generated new ways of thinking about migration and the value judgments that we make, judgments about the qualities of different kinds of migrants and the obligations that states have or do not have towards them. So this evening, I want to think about the idea of America as a land of refuge for the oppressed and persecuted, a concept that is as much a part of our national identity as the idea that we are a nation of immigrants. Both these tropes have some historical basis, but in the popular imagination, history has been overwhelmed by myth. These myths are powerful elements in our national identity, or at least in a version of our identity, let's call it the liberal version of national identity, that now seems to be at war with another identity, let's call that one the chauvinistic version, one that imagines America as being great because it is exclusive, protectionist, and unwelcoming. Perhaps in this climate, it might be overly harsh to scrutinize liberal national ideals. But I contend that if we are to resist nativism and racism, we must have more than slogans and myths. We must have knowledge. So after looking at the history of refugees and asylums, I will turn to the current moment, the situation at the US-Mexico border today, and then offer you some thoughts about the questions of political and moral responsibility. We are often reminded that America has always been an asylum for the oppressed and persecuted. This idea gives noble origins to the nation's founding. As President Jimmy Carter famously stated in 1977, human rights invented America. And to be sure, during the colonial and revolutionary period, many Europeans came to America as religious exiles, Puritans as well as Huguenots and Baptists. They did indeed seek refuge from persecution by state and church authorities in England and in France and elsewhere in Europe. But it's also the case that many of these Protestant minorities were intolerant of others who professed different faiths. The Puritans were perhaps the most notorious in this regard. They banished Quakers, whom they called pests, and hanged those who dared to return. But in fact, none of the original colonies believed in religious freedom for everybody. Many had established churches, and only Pennsylvania had an explicit anti-establishment policy. Perhaps the Puritans occupy an outsized place in our founding story because later Americans could read them as embodying the two great strands of American liberty: freedom of religion, that is, their flight from persecution, and economic liberty, that is, the possibilities of prosperity that could be realized by the Calvinist work ethic. William Penn and Roger Williams were actually more true to this combination because they founded colonies, Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, based on freedom of conscience on both ideological and economic grounds, arguing that such a policy was necessary to attract settlers and to promote trade. At the time of the nation's founding, the diversity of Protestant sects in the various colonies made it impossible to impose an official religion on the new nation. Still, the First Amendment to the Constitution, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, protected Americans only from coercion by the national government. All of the original 13 states had some form of state-supported religion, some well into the 19th century. It was not until the 1940s that the Supreme Court ruled decisively that the wall of separation, the first time it was called a wall, between church and state must be high and impregnable. But even that has not always been the case, in particular with regard to refugee resettlement, and I'll come back to that point later. What I want to emphasize here is that we have glossed over many of the complexities and contradictions in the nation's history to construct a noble origin story. Religious liberty was much more narrow than our modern understanding of the concept, and it also existed alongside other dynamics of settlement, such as the relentless dispossession of native peoples and the importation and exploitation of enslaved Africans in both the North and the South. In the 1970s, President Jimmy Carter sought to anchor a foreign policy based on human rights in the nation's hoary traditions. But he certainly misspoke when he said human rights invented America. The rights that the nation's founders invoked were not human rights as we know them today, but natural rights, life, liberty, and property, which were much more circumscribed and which applied only to educated and propertied white men. Worse, perhaps, was President Ronald Reagan's hijacking of John Winthrop's phrase, "We shall be as a city on a hill," adding the word shining to describe the city, and repurposing it into a boast of America's material abundance and proof of Americans' exceptionality. Winthrop had meant something entirely different. He was warning his fellow Puritans that if they failed to keep their covenant with God, their sins and errors would be exposed for all to see. But in another sense, Reagan was continuing a long tradition that linked the economic and the political or religious aspects of immigration. So, for example, in his first annual address, President Thomas Jefferson asked, "Shall oppressed humanity find no asylum on this globe?" Jefferson was famously committed to religious freedom, but in the context of this speech, he was primarily interested in emigration for nation building. He wanted artisans and farmers who could contribute to the nation's development both economically and by becoming good citizens. He believed that those who came with, quote, "the bona fide purpose of embarking his life and fortunes permanently with us could learn the character and capabilities of citizenship," unquote. Abraham Lincoln also desired immigration for settlement, especially to check slave expansion in the West. The rhetoric of the times suggests the enduring power of the trope of asylum. In Lincoln's words, the Homestead Act, which offered freehold title of land in the West to citizens and non-citizens alike, should, in his words, assist, quote, "people borne down by the weight of their shackles, the oppression of tyranny," unquote. Lincoln was likely not referring to the Puritans. More probably, he was thinking about the German immigrants who had come to America after the failed 1848 revolution, many of whom settled in his state, Illinois. Lincoln also advocated for immigration in anticipation of the need to rebuild the nation after the Civil War and urged Congress to pass an act to encourage immigration in 1864. So here I want to suggest that we can see how the moral appeal both justified practical aims and covered for their limits. Throughout the long era of open borders, It was easy to fuse asylum talk with nation building. And in fact, it did not really matter if immigrants came for political or economic reasons. In many cases, the distinction between them was blurry. The distinction between the economic and the political is a product of the 20th century, born, as I said, by emergency and the rise of domestic laws of restriction. That is to say, people who were rendered stateless or otherwise displaced from their homelands found no countries that would take them. The doomed voyage of the MS St. Louis, which left Germany in 1939 with 900 Jewish refugees and was refused entry at Cuba, the United States, and Canada, is perhaps just the most famous example of this refusal. At the conclusion of World War II, there were over 8 million people in so-called displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria. Most were not concentration camp survivors, but people who had been forcibly moved by the Nazis to labor for them under the Reich. 7 million people were repatriated in 1945, mostly back to the Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union, leaving 1.2 million people homeless, including Jews and people who refused repatriation to the Soviet Union. The idea of resettlement became a way to close the displaced persons camps, meet labor market needs in resettlement countries, and advance Cold War objectives. After World War II, the United Nations passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt famously contributed to its writing, and we think of it as the moment in modern refugee policy. These are some of the main articles that pertain to migration and asylum. Note, however, that while the right to exit is considered a human right, no one has the right to enter any particular country. This paradox reflects a larger problem, that we conceive of human rights as transcending the prerogatives of nation states, but they cannot be forced upon nation states. In 1951, the Geneva Convention on Refugees established 3 important principles that have guided refugee policy into our own time. First, it recognized that the problem of refugees and asylum is international in scope and nature and cannot therefore be achieved without international cooperation. This is the idea that when states fail, other states have responsibility to assist those who have been failed. Second, it defined a refugee as a person who suffered from or faced the likelihood of persecution on grounds of religion, race, ideology, etc. This created a line between the political and the economic and required that refugee and asylum be determined on an individual basis. And third, the Geneva Convention established the principle of non-refoulement, that refugees and asylum seekers could not be forcibly returned to their country of origin if they would face persecution there. So I think the need for international cooperation and the principle of no return are the 2 most important positive features of the Geneva Convention. The convention created pathways for migrants who would otherwise be excluded from other countries by their restrictive immigration laws. In this way, it made a chink in the armor of national sovereignty. But the convention also defined refugees narrowly as those who suffered from individual persecution on specified grounds. This was meant to disallow people who were escaping criminal justice in Western countries, as well as people fleeing from disaster, civil war, or other major disruptions who might not have experienced individual persecution. These distinctions were made to favor people fleeing from communism in the West, including high-profile dissidents, and quite frankly, to avoid obligation to resettle people leaving China after the 1949 revolution. Between 1949 and 1952, some 700,000 people left China for Hong Kong, then a British colony. By 1961, there were an estimated 1 million refugees living in Hong Kong, nearly 1/3 of the city's population. Government officials in the United States claimed it was impossible to tell who was a bona fide political refugee and who were the so-called rice refugees, those who left China not because they were persecuted by the communists, but in order to improve their lot in life. In fact, their condition reflected the experience of many people in the 19th century who, as I've said, motivated for both economic and political reasons. The drafters of the 1951 convention worried that if countries were asked to assist refugees and displaced persons from beyond Europe, it would be asking for too much. Indeed, the United States and the British settler colonies or nations, Canada, Australia, South Africa, had long histories of racism towards Asian and exclusion laws. The 1951 convention deliberately excluded Asia and other non-European areas to make the convention more palatable to potential signatories. As it turned out, the United States did not even sign the 1951 Geneva Convention. It was not until 1967 that it finally signed a convention of protocols which brought it under the terms of the 1951 convention. During the long tenure of national origin restrictions, presidents seeking to admit refugees fleeing from communism did so on an ad hoc basis, allowing entry under a provisional status called parole, and in some cases mortgaging their entries against future national origin quotas. American policy was driven almost entirely by Cold War interests. This was abundantly clear in the 1970s and 80s in its welcome of Cuban refugees, the only people who did not have to prove individual persecution, while denying entry to Haitian refugees who were fleeing a right-wing dictatorship that was friendly to the United States. It was not until 1980 that Congress passed a General Refugee Act, which redefined refugees according to general human rights norms defined by international conventions. It established a general allowance of 50,000 refugee admissions a year and gave the president authority to increase it according to need. Today, the United States High Commission on Refugees counts 71.44 million persons of concern, by which they mean refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people, and stateless people. That includes 20 million refugees and 3 million asylum seekers, 39 million internally displaced. Only 1% of refugees are resettled in third countries, 1%. Most remain in refugee camps in countries of the global south, 3.4 million in Turkey, nearly 1 million in Lebanon, 1.3 million in Pakistan. Kenya has hosted 3 generations of Somali refugees in the same camps for 20 years. And these figures do not include the 5 million Palestinian refugees, several generations of displaced Palestinians from the original 800,000 displaced by the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And they're counted separately because they're under a different legal administration. The United States has resettled more refugees than any other country, owing to the large numbers of Indochinese and Cubans who came during the Cold War. But in recent years, the US share of world resettlement has dramatically declined, just as the number of refugees in the world has dramatically increased. The United States now admits, on a per capita basis, fewer refugees than most industrialized nations. We are number 28 out of 43. Here on this chart, the red bars indicate refugees from Indochina. Soviet Jews in the 1990s are the green bars. Africa, the blue bars, mostly since 1990. And in the recent years, from the Syrian civil war and its effects, the beige bars. So how does one become selected for refugee resettlement? How do you get to be part of that lucky 1%? The UNHCR makes the first selection, often in consultation with receiving countries. Often those who have family members abroad or who are particularly vulnerable, like victims of torture or trafficking, are selected. The refugee cannot pick the country. Once the United States accepts a case for review, there is a process of extreme vetting, which can take 2 years or more. It involves 8 federal agencies, 6 databases, 4 biometric checks, 3 in-person interviews, and 2 interagency reviews, all conducted abroad before the refugee steps foot on American soil. Presently, there are 929 1,000 refugees and asylum seekers in the United States. More than half, 642,000, are asylum seekers, 0.2% of the total US population. The US carries a huge backlog of asylum cases. More than 500,000 cases remained on the books at the end of 2017. And I should add that nearly 90% of family members held in detention pass the first bar in the asylum process, the so-called credible fear test, in which the Border Patrol determines if the asylum seeker should be granted a full hearing. Normally, once passing the credible fear test, an asylum seeker is released while they wait for their hearing, although the Trump administration has been holding people who have already passed the credible fear test in detention as a means of deterrence, something that is legally questionable. Detention is not only cruel and unjust, it is unnecessary. Since 2001, 96% have shown up for their asylum hearing, and the final reject rate is 22%. Once they come to the United States, a refugee holds a special legal status for 1 year. Refugee resettlement costs are paid by the federal government. The last data I could find was $582 million allocated for 2015 for 70,000 refugees, which works out to $8,400 per person. They get $1,000 in cash when they arrive, and Minji benefits for 8 months, $800 for a family of 6 with no other income, plus social services like job training and English classes. Plus, they have to pay back the amount of the airfare that brought them to the United States. If a person's petition for asylum is approved, they automatically become a refugee in terms of their legal status. All refugees are required after 1 year to apply for a green card, that is, for permanent residence. That is a relatively short period in which we expect refugees to become settled and financially independent. Once they have a green card, they are eligible to apply for citizenship in 5 years. But they are also no longer eligible for welfare benefits such as Medicaid or food stamps for 5 years. The international conventions and American law that separate economic and political migrations produce other distinctions, for example, between voluntary and involuntary migration, and the idea that some people come to contribute to the nation and other people are needy victims. These distinctions connote hierarchies of preference and legitimacy. Hannah Arendt wrote movingly about the experience of Jewish refugees, about being reduced to schnorrers or beggars, about being told to forget, about the loss of their former lives and their occupational and social status, so important to everybody's identity, and to realize, quote, that in this mad world, it is much easier to be accepted as a great man than it is as a human being. In her book, Elusive Refuge, the historian Laura Madakoro describes the varied responses of Chinese who went from the PRC to Hong Kong to the label refugee. For many in southern China, it was not necessarily the first time that they or their family members had migrated to Hong Kong seeking work or safety during troubled times or war. There had been for over 100 years a back and forth movement between Guangdong province and the British colony of Hong Kong. Like many Jews, the Chinese felt there was a stigma attached to being labeled a refugee. But on the other hand, there were people who declared themselves to be refugees so they could have access to humanitarian aid. Madakoro shows us that being a refugee is not some inherent condition. Rather, it's a legal status category that is applied to certain migrants by international agencies in nation-state bureaucratic processing. Although it offers possibilities for a new life in a new country for people who cannot go home, it also poses some extraordinary burdens on refugee migrants. For example, those claiming past torture must have documentary or bodily proof, and paradoxically, once they are accepted for resettlement, nobody wants to hear about their torture or suffering, and they are expected to erase their past. Compared to immigrants whom we expect to be self-sufficient, refugees are by definition needy people. Resettlement policy provides some aid, but emphasizes getting people to be self-sufficient ASAP. We want them to suppress their traumas, to forget about ever going home, to embrace their integration into America, usually as they enter the workforce as low-skilled, low-wage workers. As one employer said, they're great because they're cheap and legal. Many are treated as a racialized underclass, stereotyped like African Americans as improvident welfare takers and criminals. Now, in our present moment, the Trump administration has flouted international and domestic law by closing the border to asylum seekers from Central America, people who are fleeing violence and political and civil disorder, much of which can be traced to past and recent U.S. intervention in the region. It then used tear gas against families trying to approach the border. Finally, it negotiated a process whereby asylum seekers must wait on the Mexican side of the border and are admitted to the Border Patrol in small numbers, where they can make their claim to asylum. This process is called metering. Rather than send troops, the government would do better, I think, to send an army of asylum officers to the border. As it is, there are a couple thousand people in Tijuana living in tents and in an unsafe environment where there's constant threat of robbery and rape. Many more continue, therefore, to attempt crossing the border and turning themselves into the Border Patrol in order to claim asylum. The wait in Tijuana is about 8 weeks. The United States allows some 40 to 50 people in a day. They are then taken to a CBP facility and put into cramped holding cells with no beds or mattresses, and kept in an extremely cold temperature where they are left for up to a week. The migrants call it La Hilera, the icebox. Detention in the icebox meets the UN definition of torture. Humanitarian legal workers at the border do what they can to inform asylum seekers what to expect when they enter the United States. They advise them to put on their warmest layer of clothing next to their body because the Border Patrol will take all other clothing from them, and advises them that their children might be taken from them. They give them a black Sharpie so they can write their name and phone number on the arms or shoulders of their children. This little girl, Fernanda Jacqueline Davila, is from Honduras. She's 2 years old. She was separated from her grandmother in July and came before the immigration court in New York in October. Imagine bringing a 2-year-old before a judge. Immigration judges say they are accustomed to teenage unaccompanied minors in their courts, but now they are regularly seeing children under the age of 6. As justification for taking children from their parents, former Attorney General Jeff Sessions claimed that asylum seekers are exploiting a loophole in the law. In effect, he turned something that is legal into a suspect category, a kind of cheating. By describing asylum as a loophole for the unauthorized entry of undesirables, he underscored the non-normative character of refugees and asylees and reconfigured them into illegal aliens. Finally, I want to just make some remarks about what should our attitude be towards refugees and asylum seekers. They raise the question of responsibility. Do we have a moral obligation to foreigners, to the international community? What is the place of human compassion in public policy? What happens when the moral seeks policy, that is, when it becomes political? Refugee admissions and resettlement are distinct from regular immigration because we bear a heightened moral responsibility to people in extraordinary circumstances, even as what counts as extraordinary can be a moving target. The entire international community bears a collective responsibility, which means that, to the extent possible, individual states should assist people whose home states have failed them. We think of moral responsibility usually in religious terms, but I also mean the ethics that attach to liberal democratic principles. That is, that all humans are of equal moral worth and possess basic human rights. So I think our challenge is this: how can we help people start a new life in a new home without pressuring them to give up themselves and their cultures, without pressuring them to assimilate, while recognizing their agency and respecting their own strategies for survival, healing, and adjustment? I'd venture to say that the refugees who are more likely to achieve some semblance of well-being are those who belong to strong ethnic communities, where they can find support from settled residents, religious institutions, and a familiar culture. Many refugees become small business owners in their communities, opening grocery stores or little restaurants or newspapers, a phenomenon we can actually trace back to the 19th century and the turn of the 20th in Chinatowns, Germantowns, and the Jewish Lower East Side, for example. These dynamics do not hinder social integration. In fact, they promote it by providing economic opportunities and ameliorating social isolation and alienation. Despite our self-congratulatory rhetoric, American values emphasize that which is individualistic, competitive, acquisitive. Compassion for the pain and suffering of others has a faint imprint on public policy. The most important exception, perhaps, was abolitionism, but we must remember that 19th century abolitionism was for a long time a radical fringe movement of religious activists, and ultimately support for slave emancipation prevailed because the moral argument was supplemented by political calculus about national unity and development. Similarly, people who opposed Chinese exclusion were the Christian missionaries, and when Congress repealed the exclusion laws in the 1940s, it did so for foreign policy reasons. In the mid-20th century, when Americans supported refugees fleeing from communism, humanitarianism coincided with strategic self-interest. But in the late 20th and 21st century, American attitudes towards refugees became more complicated by two trends. First, the shift in the figure of the refugee from Cold War freedom fighters to victims of violence, torture, and trafficking, that is, precarious subjects lacking in human agency, and therefore possibly with endless need and with dubious potential to become good Americans, or worse, as potential or actual terrorists. And second, by the rise of privatization, the increased emphasis on individual security and prosperity, the decline of the social. The ethics that normatively attach to liberal democratic principles diminish in proportion to the rise of me first and America first. As I've tried to show, Americans have historically used the rhetoric of compassion to make more noble its economic self-interest. Today, we hear a little bit about compassion and only about self-interest. But here's a little secret. Americans in some areas of the country want refugees because they need workers. They even compete for them. Just this week on Monday, the New York Times published an article about cities in upstate New York that have welcomed refugees in an effort to reverse decades-long trends of population decline. Under this administration, New York has received only 1/5 of the number of refugees it received under Obama. New York State is providing funds to refugee resettlement agencies to make up for the shortfall in federal funds, and cities like Buffalo, Utica, and Syracuse are luring refugees to relocate from other parts of the country. Maine, Vermont, and Wyoming have similar initiatives. Similarly, Germany has nearly 1.5 million refugees, more than any other European country. Germany has a labor shortage and a population decline. Even as xenophobia and attacks on refugees continue in Germany, an economist with the Chamber of Commerce in Hanover stated, quote, "We have real reasons, not just soft feel-good ones, to assist and help and push refugees into vocational training. The German economy needs qualified workers," unquote. Not surprising, refugee resettlement in the United States is largely the domain of religious groups like Church World Services, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and other voluntary agencies. They are funded by the government and private donations. Communities of faith do the work of the nation, caring for impossible subjects who are otherwise scorned and refused, and to them we are grateful. And at a time when our political culture seems devoid of basic human kindness, it might seem overly harsh to point to the limits of humanitarian concern. Yet humanitarianism is a complex phenomenon. While motivated by compassion and care for suffering, and I think that's a good thing, humanitarianism must be understood as a social relation. It is asymmetrical in its distribution of power and agency, and commonly fraught with paternalism and the urge for social control. The refugee is construed as a passive victim whom we must transform into a proper liberal subject and from whom we expect gratitude. And when the argument that refugees can help our economy might make people more welcoming, it might seem overly harsh to criticize self-interest. My point is not to reject or condemn humanitarianism or self-interest, but to ask us to think about both the power and limits of each approach, about what happens when the moral meets the political, how religion and politics are increasingly blurred, and what it means that we no longer think a democracy requires moral policies and practices. I'd like us to think about what the anthropologist Didier Fasson asks, quote, "What is gained and what is lost when we use terms of suffering to speak of inequality, when we invoke trauma rather than recognizing violence, when we mobilize compassion rather than justice?" Thank you so much. So now I'm going to welcome Professor Morimoto, or you're going to introduce him. Okay, thank you so much.
Hi, please help me give another round of applause to Professor May. That's amazing. So right now, I'm going to, did anyone write down questions on the note cards? We're going to have people come around and collect those if you have any. If you could just kindly raise those up. And while we do that, my name's Manali. I'm one of the resident assistants with UCLA Residential Life. I'm an RA in Dykstra Hall and a third-year human biology and society major. And it's my honor to introduce Professor Hiroshi Motomura. Hiroshi Motomura is a teacher and scholar of immigration and citizenship with influence across a range of academic disciplines and in federal, state, and local policymaking. His book, Americans in Waiting, The Lost Story of Immigration and Citizenship in the United States, won the Professional and Scholarly Publishing Award from the Association of American Publishers as the year's best book in law and legal studies, and was chosen by the U.S. Department of State for its suggested reading list for foreign service officers. He is a co-author of 2 immigration-related casebooks, Immigration and Citizenship, Process and Policy, and Forced Migration, Law and Policy, and he has published many widely cited articles on immigration and citizenship. His most recent book, Immigration Outside the Law, won the Association of American Publishers Law and Legal Studies 2015 Prose Award, and was chosen by the Association of College and Research Libraries as a Choice Outstanding Academic Title. Please help me give a warm welcome to Professor Hiroshi Motomura.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Ngai, for a really very enlightening and very thought-provoking talk. So I'm going to just offer a few comments here. I also want to admit to you that I'm improvising this. So I feel like, I've been asked to sit in as a musician with a great band, and I know the topic and I know what the key of the song is in, and now I'm just going to have to take a solo. So here's what it is. I think that the best service I can provide is to just sort of reflect on the fact that I've learned so much from Professor Ngai's work over the years, and really thinking about not just immigration, but also citizenship, belonging, the making of the American nation, whatever that may mean, and how we really understand that. It's been very influential to me. And so as she was talking, I was thinking about ways in which I could talk about how that work has influenced me, and for which I'm very grateful, but in ways that I think help us understand and interpret a lot of what she has to say today and how it relates to current events. And so let me just say a few words about 4 things. One is about time, the meaning of time. The second thing I could address is what does law have to do with this? The third thing is to say something about the stories we tell. And the fourth thing is to say something about how we perceive reality. And I think all these things are in what you have to say, and I think it's worth reflecting on this to take the very rich stories you've told in the history of refugees and mother of exiles and relate it to the current political moment. One of the things I learned, not just from what you said tonight, but really from your book, Impossible Subjects, is that we in this modern age, or in any age, take the meaning of words as if they've always been the meaning of those words. And that's never really true. So today, tonight we've talked about refugee isn't quite exactly what it meant 100 years ago or 200 years ago is not exactly what it means today. It's really evolved over time. In the same way that the whole idea of undocumented, irregular migrants It's no accident the subtitle of your book is Illegal Aliens in the Making of Modern America, because in many respects the story of undocumented immigration in this country is a story of making people illegal. Not that was something from the very beginning. I think even the word citizen is something that we assign a certain meaning to, and it's not really the meaning that it always had. In the 19th century, the line that mattered wasn't the line between citizens and non-citizens. And that may be the line that really matters a lot now, but the line that mattered in the 19th century was who could become a citizen and who could not become a citizen. Slightly different line, and that line was very much based on race. So I just want to point out that one of the things that's important to understand the current moment is to understand that the word refugee, it has a certain significance now in the news cycle and in the courts, but it didn't always have that meaning. And that really brings up the idea that someone created the refugee idea, someone has changed it, and that's been a very political process and a very political act that isn't God-given in any sense, but it really reflects a lot of human and political pressure. I think it's a way to understand sort of the story and the arc that history has taken. The second thing I want to say about it follows from that, and it's about law. So, refugee is a legal term now. I'm not sure it started out as a legal term, but certainly by the time you get to the Geneva Convention in 1951. But I think that what happens is that a lot of times, and we see this certainly in the current administration, there's this word refugee that's used. But if you start with the idea that it has this manufactured meaning, not necessarily a bad meaning, but that it's made, it's made by people, then you realize that the law and the term refugee really hides a lot of things. It hides a lot of things, and I think that one of the things it hides is one of many things it hides is discretion and who's really making the decisions. And so what happens, what you're seeing right now is the refugee definition has had a lot of back and forth, a lot of contestation. And what really matters isn't the fact that Congress enacted a law that protects refugees, and that's important, but what really happens, where it really matters is who applies that definition and who doesn't apply that definition, and the rules for people to access that system and to claim the protection that international law gives them. And if the government decides that they're not going to send asylum seekers, asylum officers to the border, but instead is going to meter applications, then that's really where the law is being made. And so that's the second point, really, is that this is really about who decides. And the same way that in enforcement against the undocumented, it's really not the law that matters, it's really where the arrests are made and what neighborhoods those raids are taking place. And then the question, of course, is what are the principles or what are the factors that influence what are the factors that influence that decision making? And I think that the story of the refugees, the refugee definition having a tremendous context of Cold War politics, certainly politics is one of the factors that influences decision making. Of course, another one that influences decision making is race and ethnicity, and that can't be forgotten. So that's also part of the story. The third thing that follows from all this, if you combine the role of time and the role of law, the role of words actually, is another way to understand what you've told us is to think about the stories we tell, right? The stories we tell, which is sometimes a collective invocation of time, sometimes it's a collective amnesia about time, sometimes it's nostalgia, and it uses words like refugee and immigrant and citizen. One of the stories, I mean, right now we're really having a contest of stories, right? The contest is between the position that asylum is a loophole, and it's a source of illegitimacy, and a story that one of the strengths of this country is our willingness to accept people. In a combination of things that include both humanitarian impulses and long-term economic self-interest and rejuvenation. So that's another aspect of, I think, tonight's talk, is to really understand this as a contest of stories. It's also a contest of nostalgia. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about immigration policy is that everyone seems to be nostalgic about the time of the nation, the golden age of immigration. But the real contest is between people who think it's now and the people who think it was a generation ago, right? And that's the contest. I mean, everyone, even the most restrictionist people are invoking the memories of the grandparents who came here under whatever circumstances. And then, but the question is, are you the sort of person who interprets that history to say, well, and so we should accept people too, people like my grandparents, or is your reaction going to be, they came, but the doors are now closed, the boat's full, right? So it's really about nostalgia stories, loopholes. And the last point I'll make is about reality, because Professor Ngai, you talked about this in terms of the reason people come from Central America, or the reason people flee, and the responsibility that countries have. I think a lot of what I took out of your comments is that we also have a contest or a debate about causation and about responsibility. It's really a contest over the answer to the question why. And so, on the one hand, one of the ways you can think about this is to decide exactly how this country looks at its border and thinks about why people are coming to this country, fleeing the circumstances they feel compelled to flee. And if you take a relatively narrow view of causation, then I think you would end up taking a pretty hard line on asylum and really try to narrow the definition and either close the border or make it very difficult to claim asylum. But of course, the other view is that people migrate for all kinds of reasons, and those kinds of reasons are not even isolatable in the generation in which we live, but really go back a long, long ways. One of the things that's most interesting about the history of the decades before the American Civil War was the attempts by slaveholders in the United States to establish, actually to invade Cuba, to make it into a slave state, and also to do similar things in Central America. And so, so we have the long history of a relationship, very unfortunate relationship or treatment by the United States of Central America. And so it's really a question of, if we think about refugees, it's also tied up in the story of why we got to here. And much of the political moment I think we have right now is a moment that really is a contestation of how closely we want to look at it. In other words, do we only look at the United States history, or do we look at the global context? Do we only look at the current decade, or we think back 50 or 100 years or even further to figure out how we got here? And then depending on where you end up on that, you end up with a completely different politics and a completely different set of solutions. So these are all ways to understand, I think, the story of the Mother of Exiles. And I think it's so important that we think about this in this moment, not just because of what's going on with refugees and asylum and what's going on the border, but it's almost as if asylum and refugee policy is a stand-in for larger questions about the border, and the larger questions about the border are a stand-in for how we think about this country. And how we think about this country is very much a way of how we think about the world and really the future of humanity. And so that's just a way of thinking about it, just a few thoughts and reflections that really try to maybe think about everything you've provided us about Mother of Exiles, but in a way that tries to think about how we can all draw meaning from it. Thank you.
Would like to now have May and Hiroshi up here on the stage. And we have collected a lot of the cards. And Professor Motomura will lob questions at Professor Ngai. Friendly question.
So this is like in law school, right, where you sort of call on people and ask questions. Okay, so let me just read this. First question is, how does preparing for the credible fear test impact refugee psyche? To pass the test, you must prove you're helpless, need to be saved, etc. By putting oneself in this mindset, how does this impact one's ability to cope, to be resilient, and to be independent?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. So whoever asked the question, thank you. I don't know really the answer. I'll maybe think out loud about it. Not having had to do that myself, I think it's something that we should all try to do, is to put ourselves in the shoes of a refugee, somebody explaining why they are afraid to go home. The stories that I read in the newspaper are about people who lost a family member to violence and felt their own lives were threatened. And that's why they fled Honduras or another country in Central America. Often that violence is from gangs who are trying to recruit young men into their ranks. And they kill people who don't comply. So it's a real threat. And I don't know, I mean, I think that usually passes, you would know more about this than I do. I think that gets you over the first hurdle. I mean, a very high percentage of people who are given the credible fear test actually pass it at that point. Fewer people pass the final test. I think if you have a lawyer, it really helps you at the asylum hearing. People have to prepare for the test, so it's an ordeal. And you can think about, maybe you're nervous when you have to take a math test. Can you imagine what it's like when you have to take the asylum test? And you know, there are, you know, when people say they've been tortured, right? If they have scars, they can show their scars. But what if they don't have scars? Does that mean they don't have a trauma? And how do you prove that? So there's actually like a little cottage industry of psychologists who will provide an affidavit that says you suffer from PTSD. So then you have people, conservatives, who will say that they're being coached or they're making it up. And so this becomes a whole, you know, a whole kind of morass of a bureaucracy. So those of you who are students of Asian American history, you would know that during the exclusion era, we had the paper sons, and people had to memorize, you know, all kinds of arcane facts about their home village to try to prove that they were who they said they were. And it was a very similar kind of thing. Maybe they weren't saying they were tortured, but they had to prove in an interrogation their claim of their identity. So I think we put people through a very terrible process. And I suppose at one level it's not unreasonable to say if you are claiming asylum, you have to show you have a case. On its face, I don't think that's unreasonable. But then it spawns a whole bureaucratic procedure that, you know, I think is cruel to make people relive these experiences. I don't know, what do you think about this?
Is this thing on? No, maybe not. Okay, this is really, okay. Live mic. No, I think the credible fear test, I mean, it really reveals two things about law that are not that nice or positive about law. I mean, one is that, you know, the refugee idea is really created as an exception. And so we got to figure out some way to keep it narrow. And one of the ways you keep it narrow, just being cynical, is to set up a system where you have to go through a lot, you know. And I think that's done at least knowingly, maybe even intentionally. The other thing is really that second part of the question, which has to do with what it does to people. I think one of the other things about that I think, and I certainly feel this in law school, it's important to remember is that you solve someone's legal problem, you don't solve their problems. You don't solve all their problems, and there are many people for whom there's a legal solution in terms of legal status, but there's inadequate attention paid to helping them as a whole. So let me get to the next question, which is, how can the Asian Pacific and Pacific Islander community help to prevent the present wave of deportations against refugees, for example, Cambodians and Vietnamese? Use the live mic.
Well, I think you guys know what you're doing already is what we need to do, right? To educate the community, to mobilize, to be present when people have hearings, to have good lawyers who will donate their services to them. I think the data show pretty clearly that if you have a lawyer in a deportation proceeding, you'll fare much better than if you have no lawyer. That doesn't mean you will succeed, but your chances are better. You know, I think the problem is that the big problem is that these laws are harsh, they're very strict. We don't have, you know, we used to, this is about how things change over time, right? When deportation first became a mass kind of phenomenon, you know, in the late 1920s, it was very strict and very harsh, and people protested. They said, you can't just apply rules to people regardless of their circumstance, of their histories, and you have to look at their experiences. And so it took many years of lobbying and litigation to establish what in law is called discretion, that the judge has some discretion to decide in a case, that there's some room to hear somebody's story and to make a reasonable decision. In 1996, Congress passed a law, this is under the Clinton administration, that basically eliminated discretion from removal proceedings. And we have a whole list of reasons that require mandatory removal. That's you cannot go before a judge and give your story. If you commit a certain offenses, you have to be removed. And this has taken a terrible toll on people. And so, and even within discretion has changed over the years, right? There used to be a hardship clause where you could say, if you deport me, I or my family will suffer hardship. And what hardship means has changed over the years, right? Now it's almost impossible to make a hardship claim, right? Even if you say, if your child is deported, they will be unable to receive medical care for a life-threatening condition. That's not considered hardship anymore, right? So we have a lot of the way that these administrative rulings, you know, these are not things that Congress decides. These are things that are decided in the executive branch that make it harder and harder for people to actually make to plea on their behalf. So, I mean, I think you know a lot more about this than I do as an immigration professor, law professor. But I think this is something I wrote about in my book, is kind of the history of discretion in the law. And should law be something that's rigid, like black line, black letter law that is followed to the letter? Or is law something that is more living, you know, that should have some flexibility, that should room for human experience and story? This is part of the history of law in this country, right? These different ideas of what law should be. So I don't know how to stop the deportations of Southeast Asians. I guess that's the last thing I'll say, but I think, you know, grassroots mobilization and having good legal advice is probably, at this point, the best we can do until those bigger policies change.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really excellent and super important point about it's really what the executive branch is doing, right? I mean, I think what's remarkable actually about what this administration has been able to do is it's been able to do it through executive orders and allocations of budgets and just policies and memos without changing any of the statutes, without changing actual laws in terms of we think of Congress. So that's a super important point. The other thing, I mean, and you also, I think, really put your finger on the fact that this is really a question about how change happens, right? And you know, last spring I was on sabbatical, and I spent some of the time in Berlin, where, of course, a wall separated East and West Berlin for 30 years, basically. And there's like this little remaining section of the wall. You've probably seen that, a little remaining section of the wall, and there's and that's kind of preserved as kind of a, I guess, a memorial to what happened. And there's a school group there, and the teacher saying to the school group, you know, there used to be a wall here, but there used to be a wall here, and it's not here anymore. And at the same time, I was struck about how the people who got that wall to come down, they were small, everyday people doing what they thought was the right thing at the moment, and the leaders of East Germany didn't realize until literally the night before the wall fell that it was coming down. They thought they were safe for another generation. It was a lot of people doing what they thought was the right thing to do. Next question, I think addresses what you were saying about the economy. What are the impacts of highlighting immigrants and refugees' contribution to the economy? This furthers neoliberal values of valuing immigrant bodies as labor, but this strategy can also be helpful in swaying the center-right in the US.
Right, that's a great insight. And, you know, I think I ended my talk on maybe a little bit of an ambivalence about, should we say that immigrants are good for the economy, meaning they're good for low-wage jobs, you know, or should we say, you know, we should have compassion for people, and which has a positive and negative effects in terms of how people are constructed. So I think we have to do both, and we have to reframe what responsibility means, and I think we have to give a lot more credit to the immigrant and refugee communities themselves. I think that's the key, is that they are the ones who actually make change. They're the ones who help each other, help themselves, and it's kind of a huge irony, I think, that, you know, we criticize the government for being so stingy in the supports that it gives to refugees. It's you know, you have to pay back the airfare that got you here from, you know, somewhere in the global south. That just blew my mind away, that you have to pay back the airfare, and they give you, you know, $1,000 to start off, and they expect you to be trauma-free or not talk about it or whatever in a year. So on the other hand, so what happens is that the voluntary agencies, they do some work, and it's not to be discounted. They help find people an apartment, they direct them to English classes. Some do more than others. But I think what really happens is that those communities themselves do the work, right? They have their own community centers, mutual aid associations, their own religious organizations, their own revolving credit associations. This is a story of how immigrants in America have always built their own communities, built their own ethnic communities, and have enabled newcomers into those communities to adjust and to integrate into society. And in a sense, this is what happened in the 19th century, right, before the government did anything for anybody. So I don't want that to sound like, you know, like we don't want government support, because I think we do need the state to support people. But I think if we recognize that the refugees themselves are not passive victims, but they themselves build their own communities, and if we listen to them respectfully, then I think we can start to have other Americans understand what they're doing and what they're going through. So I think a lot of that is to listen, to hear their stories, and to try to move that into something that could resemble a change in policy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the question, because I think a lot of the stories of the problems that this country has had over the way we've thought about borders have been thinking about immigrant labor and as workers, right? And not as people. In fact, the Swiss writer Max Frisch once talked about the European experience with immigrants, and he said, you know, we wanted workers, but people came. And but I also heard you to be saying, and I really very much agree with it. I heard you to be saying, not just that, really not about treating immigrants as workers only, but really, in a sense, I heard you to be questioning the line that's often drawn between family immigration and refugee immigration and worker immigration, right? I mean, because workers have families you know, and families work. And this is yet another sort of artificial distinction that can be exploited. Okay, next question. What resources would you recommend to people who would like to learn more about this issue?
Well, you can read his stuff that he's written. I'm blanking, but there's some actually really interesting work that I've read in the last several years about refugee communities, refugee resettlement. One really interesting book is by a political scientist named Carolyn Wong. What's the name of it? It's about Hmong Americans in politics, about 1.5 and second generation Hmong young people who are actually running for office in places like Nebraska and Minnesota. And how they represent themselves is just fascinating, because they don't run as Asian Americans. They figured out how to present themselves as being akin to indigenous people. Because they say in Laos, we are like the indigenous in this country. So they figured out a way to narrate their past and their community that was very savvy, I think, in terms of presenting themselves as indigenous, as something that, I mean, obviously they're not Native Americans, but it gives people a way to think about them not as refugees, not even as Asian American immigrants, but as people that have a very particular past and a very particular kind of culture. And it invites people to think about them in a non-stereotyped way, right? So I think that's a really interesting book. I have a student who wrote her dissertation on Hmong resettlement and religious adaptation and conversion. And it's a really fascinating book about how some Hmong converted to Christianity through their interactions with the resettlement agencies, and others continued in their own shamanistic traditions. But they were very smart. Like, they figured out how to explain their spiritual outlook as a religion, because it's not really a religion in the way we think of religion, but they figured out how to present themselves as a religion because it had very practical benefits. Like, if you were in a hospital, you could have a shaman come visit you, right, if it was your religion, right? And then she interviewed those who converted to Christianity, and the most popular denomination were the evangelicals. And she thought that was interesting because the really nice, touchy-feely workers were the Lutherans, right? But they liked the evangelicals because they were the fiercest. And to them, you want a fierce God, a fierce spirit to guide you. So they weren't just really converting and rejecting everything in their own spiritual outlook, they were adapting. And they said, okay, in this country, they have their own religions, but we want the fierce ones, right? So I think that, and then they had, I'm going on too long here, but the best story in her dissertation was about how, because a lot of their practices involve animal sacrifice, that they come up against local ordinances that prohibit things like this. So they had to figure out how to continue with these rituals in a way that would not be breaking the law. And their final allowance was that if all else fails, you can use a stuffed animal.
So, yeah, I'll also take the question as sort of it's a question not just about what resources would you recommend to people, but also how to engage, right? I mean, I think going to session at the Northwest Campus Auditorium is a good start. But beyond that, I mean, I think one of the things that's, this issue is so pervasive now in the political arena, regardless of how you think about this politically, that there's going to be something that touches you in some way. And I don't think it's necessary for each of us to take the burden of knowing everything about everything. But there's something that touches you in some way, maybe some member of your family, some of the community, a friend you know, and your experience here on campus. And that's just a window into reading. And the reading could be very broad, right? It could be works of history, but it also could be novels, it could be songs, it could be movies, and each one of them builds on each other. And I think it's a journey that you can take.
Okay, I'm going to make one other reading suggestion and then have a very different suggestion. The best novel I think I read in recent years is called Exit West by Hamid Moshid, which is a kind of slightly futuristic book about refugees. And I'll just recommend it. I won't tell you what it's about. But the other thing you can do is get involved with groups in the community. I think in Los Angeles there are lots of immigrant rights organizations, and you can volunteer. You can they need people to help with all kinds of things. If you speak a language other than English, you could probably help as a translation in legal cases. A lot of organizations provide know your rights kinds of trainings in immigrant communities. You could support those. You could be somebody who could be trained yourself to then train other people. There are I saw this great exhibit. I think it was students from UC San Diego had a relationship with students in Mexico on the other side of the border, and they had a cross-border project that was promoting environmental reforms on the border. So there are all kinds of things you can do. You just have to look around and see them.
And that's a great segue to look up here, because we have a program really organized by the United Khmer Students, the Vietnamese Student Association, the Asian Pacific Coalition, and the Asian American Graduate Student Association. And really this is a call to action. We have, actually we're able to fly out thanks to the Laus, Jenny Shrey and Manta Chum, who were involved in the Free Minnesota 8, the Minnesota 8 cases. And so they'll be talking about resistance and how they were able to win some of those cases. And then we'll have several local leaders, Danny Tongshe from the Asian Prisoner Support Committee, Billy Tang from API RISE, and Sheila Tsai from Khmer Girls in Action. So we really encourage you to come back next week, Thursday, I think same time, but a different place. It'll be at the Tom Bradley International Hall, room 300, and really engage with the students here. If you want to get involved, talk to the students here, who will also present what's happening, what they're going to be up to over the next upcoming year. So can we give Mei Nai a round of applause, and also to Hiroshi Motomura. Thank you very much for coming again.